Marquis de Sade, born June 2nd, 1740, Paris, France, was a French nobleman whose perverted sexual preferences and erotic writings coined the term sadism. His best-known work is the novel Justine, 1791. Related to the royal house of Condé, the de Sade family numbered among its ancestors 𝙎𝙪𝙗𝙀, whom the 14th century Italian poet Petrarch immortalized in verse. When the Marquis was born at the Condé mansion, his father was away from home on a diplomatic mission. After early schooling with his uncle, Abbé de Sade of Ébrouis, the Marquis continued his studies at the Lycée Louis le Grand in Paris. His aristocratic background entitled him to various ranks in the king's regiments, and in 1754 he began a military career, which he abandoned in 1763 at the end of the 7 Years' War. In that year, he married the daughter of a high-ranking bourgeois family de Robe, the Montreuil. By her, he had 2 sons, Louis-Marie and Donatien Claude Armand, and 1 daughter, Madeleine Laure. In the first months of his marriage, he began an affair with an actress, La Beauvoisin, who had had many previous patrons. He invited prostitutes to his little house in Arquet and subjected them to various sexual abuses. For this, he was imprisoned by order of the king in the castle of Vincennes. Released a few weeks later, he resumed his debauched life and went deeply into debt. In 1768, the first public scandal broke out, the Rose Keller affair. Rose Keller was a young prostitute he had met on Easter Sunday in Paris. He took her to his house in Arquet, where he locked her up and abused her sexually. She escaped and related the unnatural acts and brutality to persons in the neighborhood and showed them her wounds. De Sade was sentenced to the fortress of Pierre-en-Cise near Lyon for his offenses. After his release, he retired to his chateau of Lacoste. In June 1772, he went to Marseille to get some much-needed money. There he engaged his male servant Latour to find him some prostitutes, upon whom the Marquis committed his usual sexual excesses. The young women helped themselves liberally to the Marquis's pillbox, filled with candies that contained the aphrodisiac Spanish fly. When soon thereafter they suffered upset stomachs, they feared they had been poisoned. De Sade and Latour fled to the estates of the King of Sardinia, who had them arrested. The Parlement at Aix sentenced them to death by default, and on September 12, 1772, executed them in effigy. After escaping from the fortress of Miolans, de Sade took refuge in his chateau at Lacoste, rejoining his wife. She became his accomplice and shared his pleasures, until the parents of the neighborhood boys and girls he had abducted complained to the crown prosecutor. De Sade fled to Italy, accompanied by his sister-in-law, the Canoness de Launay, who had become his mistress. He returned to Lacoste on November 4, 1776. One incident followed another in an atmosphere of continual scandal, and on his return to Paris, the Marquis was arrested and sent to the dungeon of Vincennes on February 13, 1777. Conditions in this prison were harsh. During his detention, de Sade quarreled with his jailer, with the prison director, and with a fellow prisoner, Victor Riquetti, the Marquis de Mirabeau, whom he had insulted. He tried to incite the other prisoners to revolt. Visits from his wife, who was eventually allowed to see him, were banned after an episode in which he fell into a fit of jealous rage precipitated by his suspicion that she was about to leave him and was plotting against him. The Marquis retired to a convent. De Sade overcame his boredom and anger in prison by writing sexually graphic novels and plays. In July 1782, he finished his Dialogue between a priest and a dying man, in which he declared himself an atheist. His letters to his lawyer as well as to his wife combine incisive wit with an implacable spirit of revolt. On February 27, 1784, he was transferred to the Bastille in Paris. On a roll of paper some 12 meters long, he wrote 120 Days of Sodom, in which he graphically describes numerous varieties of sexual perversion. In 1787, he wrote his most famous work, an early version of Justine, and in 1788, the novellas, tales, and short stories were later published in the volume entitled Crimes of Passion. A few days before the French revolutionaries stormed the Bastille on July 14, 1789, de Sade shouted through a window, "They are massacring the prisoners. "You must come and free them." He was transferred to the insane asylum at Charenton, where he remained until April 2, 1790. Upon his release, de Sade offered several plays for the Comédie Française as well as other theatres. Although 5 of them were accepted, not all were carried out. Separated from his wife, he now lived with a young actress, the widow 𝙎ᴜ, and wrote his novels Justine, or Misfortunes of Virtue, and Juliet. In 1792, he became secretary of the revolutionary section of l'Épique in Paris, was one of the delegates appointed to visit the hospitals in Paris, and wrote several patriotic speeches. During the Reign of Terror, he saved the lives of his father-in-law Montreuil and that of the latter's wife, although they were responsible for his various imprisonments. He gave speeches in the name of the revolution, but was nevertheless accused of moderateness and wrongly included in the list of emigrants. He escaped the guillotine by chance the day before the revolutionary leader Robespierre was overthrown. At that time, he lived with the widow 𝙎ᴜ in conditions of dire poverty. On March 6, 1801, he was arrested at his publisher, where handwritten copies of Justine and Juliet and several handwritten manuscripts were found. Again, he was sent to Charenton, where he caused new scandals. His repeated protests had no effect on Napoleon, who saw for himself that de Sade was deprived of all freedom of movement. He succeeded, however, in having his plays performed at Charenton, with the prisoners themselves as actors. He began work on an ambitious 10-volume novel, at least 2 volumes of which were written, The Days of Florbel, or Nature Revealed. After his death, his eldest son burned these writings along with other manuscripts. His remains were scattered. In his will drawn up in 1806, he asked that the traces of my grave disappear from the face of the earth, as I flatter myself that my memory will be effaced from the mind of men. In the course of a life that scandalized his contemporaries, de Sade lived out many examples of the sexual compulsion on which his work centered. His writings were banned in France until the 1960s. As an author, de Sade is to some an incarnation of absolute evil, who advocates the unleashing of instincts even to the point of crime. Others have looked upon him as a champion of total liberation through the satisfaction of his desires in all forms. De Sade's works were widely read in the 19th century, especially by writers and artists. At the outset of the 20th century, the French poet 𝙎𝙜ᴜ Apollinaire helped to establish de Sade's status in the domain of culture. Today, de Sade's writings can be more comfortably categorized. They belong to the history of ideas and mark an important moment in the history of literature, with de Sade figuring as the first of the damned writers.